I first noticed something was wrong when my daughter Chloe stopped playing outside. Normally, she was a bundle of energy, running through the yard until dusk, chasing butterflies or kicking a soccer ball around. Every evening I'd have to call her in multiple times for dinner before she would finally come inside, breathless and flushed, with a wide grin on her face. But lately, something had changed. Instead of playing in the yard, Chloe spent her afternoons indoors, sitting by the large window in the living room, her small body motionless as she stared out into the backyard. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids go through phases, right? I assumed maybe she was just tired, or maybe she was inventing some new, quiet game for herself. But after several days of this odd behavior, I began to worry. It was a cool autumn evening when I first noticed the shift from peculiar to terrifying. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the yard. I was in the kitchen, finishing up dinner, when I called for Chloe. "Chloe, dinner's ready." No response. My stomach twisted as a strange silence filled the air. Normally, she'd be running to the table, eager to eat after a long day of play. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to find her. I found her standing by the window again, her small hand pressed flat against the glass, her face pale and expressionless as she gazed out into the yard. "Chloe?" I called softly, stepping closer. "Honey, what are you looking at?" She didn't respond right away. Her eyes remained fixed on something just beyond the tree line at the far end of our yard. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, so soft that I had to strain to hear it. "The man by the tree, he's waving at me." A jolt of fear shot through me. I hurried to the window, scanning the yard for any sign of movement, any figure lurking near the trees. But the yard was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The only movement was the gentle sway of the branches in the evening breeze. "There's no one there, sweetie," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's just your imagination." But Chloe didn't move. Her eyes remained locked on the tree, her face expressionless. "He's tall and pale," she said, her voice unnervingly matter-of-fact. "And he says I should come play with him." My heart skipped a beat. Cold dread settled in my chest, an icy grip tightening around my lungs. I forced a smile and gently pulled her away from the window, my hand trembling slightly as I brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "Why don't we play inside, okay?" I suggested, trying to distract her from whatever strange thoughts were filling her mind. She nodded, but her gaze remained distant, as though she was still seeing something I couldn't. From that night on, Chloe's behavior became more unsettling. Every evening, without fail, I would find her at the window, her little fingers tracing patterns on the glass, her lips moving in hushed whispers. I would ask her what she was doing, but she would always give me the same answer. "I'm talking to the pale man." Each time she said it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to believe it was just a figment of her imagination, a harmless childhood fantasy. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was something about the way she spoke, the way her eyes seemed to grow distant when she talked about him, that filled me with a growing sense of dread. Weeks passed, and things only got worse. Chloe started waking up in the middle of the night, her screams shattering the stillness of the house. She would cry out for me, her voice trembling with fear as she told me about the pale man, how he was angry because I wouldn't let her go outside to play with him. Her once vibrant, playful spirit had withered, replaced by a pale, hollow version of the little girl I once knew. She stopped eating, barely picking at her food, and her once rosy cheeks grew gaunt and sunken, as though something was draining the life from her. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was just a branch against the window, but as I listened more closely, I realized the sound was coming from inside the house, from Chloe's room. Heart pounding, I threw off the covers and rushed down the hallway, the tapping growing louder with each step. When I reached Chloe's room, the door was slightly ajar and cold air spilled into the hallway. I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat. The window was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the icy breeze, and Chloe was gone. I ran to the window, my heart racing. Panic gripped me as I scanned the yard, and then I saw her, standing at the edge of the backyard, her tiny silhouette bathed in the eerie glow of the full moon. She was barefoot, her thin nightgown billowing in the wind, and she was staring at the large oak tree at the far end of the yard. I didn't hesitate. I bolted outside, the cold air stinging my skin as I screamed her name. My feet pounded across the grass, my pulse racing in my ears. Chloe didn't move, didn't even flinch as I approached. She just stood there, frozen, her small body trembling. "Chloe," I cried, my voice thick with terror. "What are you doing? Come inside." She turned slowly to face me, her eyes wide and glassy with fear. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's here." My blood ran cold. I followed her gaze to the tree, but there was nothing there, just the twisted branches swaying in the wind. But the air around us felt wrong, thick, with a heavy, oppressive presence that made it hard to breathe. "Come here," I said, my voice shaking. I grabbed her, pulling her toward me, but as I did, she resisted, her small hands gripping the air as though someone was pulling her back. "Mommy, he's angry," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "He says you're keeping me from him. He says I have to go with him now." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like ice piercing through my heart. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as I ran back to the house, the cold wind howling behind us. As I slammed the door shut, I heard it. A faint, distant whisper carried on the wind. "She'll come back, they always do." My heart pounded in my chest as I locked the door, my hands trembling violently. I could still feel the weight of his presence, lingering just outside, watching, waiting. Chloe clung to me, her small body shaking with fear, but she didn't say another word. After that night, Chloe never mentioned the pale man again. But the damage had already been done. She stopped talking, stopped smiling, stopped playing altogether. She became a hollow shell of the vibrant, joyful child she once was. And every night, without fail, I would find her standing by the window, her hand pressed against the glass, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something, someone. The air in the house grew colder with each passing day. Shadows stretched longer, darker, twisting in the corners of the rooms like living things. At night, I would hear faint footsteps echoing down the hall, soft whispers seeping through the walls, and the unmistakable sound of tapping, always tapping, coming from Chloe's room. I tried everything, burning sage, placing salt at the windowsills, even calling a priest to bless the house. But nothing worked. The pale man wasn't going to leave. He had set his sights on Chloe, and no matter what I did, I couldn't stop him. One night, I woke to find Chloe missing from her bed again. Panic surged through me as I raced down the hallway to her room, but this time, the window was closed. Instead, I found her standing in the middle of the living room, her back to me, her head tilted slightly to one side as though she were listening to something I couldn't hear. "Chloe?" I called, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't move. Slowly, I approached her, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached her, I placed a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to face me. Her eyes were black, not dark brown, not shadowed, but completely black, void of any color, any light. Her mouth twisted into a slow, eerie smile as she stared up at me, her voice barely more than a whisper. "He's here, Mommy," she said, her voice cold and lifeless. "He's waiting for me." I stumbled back, my mind racing, terror clawing at my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Chloe took a step forward, her smile growing wider, and in the darkness behind her, I saw it, the tall, pale figure emerging from the shadows, its long, bony fingers reaching for her. And then, everything went black. When I woke, Chloe was gone. The house was empty, silent. There was no sign of her, no trace of the pale man, but I knew he had taken her. He'd claimed her, just like he had always intended. Now, every night, I sit by the window, staring out into the backyard, waiting. And sometimes, if I listen closely, I can hear the faint sound of laughter, Chloe's laughter, drifting through the trees. But it's not the joyful, innocent laugh I remember. It's cold, twisted, a sound that chills me to my very core. I know she's out there, with him, and I know one day she'll come back, because they always do.
It started innocently enough. I was standing at the sink, elbows deep in sudsy water, scrubbing away at the remains of dinner. The clinking of dishes echoed softly through the kitchen as the evening settled into a peaceful quiet. From down the hallway, I could hear the gentle hum of Emily, my 5-year-old daughter, chatting away in her room. She was always talking, whether to herself or to her stuffed animals, her boundless imagination creating entire worlds that I would catch glimpses of from time to time. But this time, something was different. The usual innocent chatter made me pause. I froze mid-wash, listening more intently. "Stop it, Tommy, that tickles," she giggled. The sound was muffled through the walls, but the name rang clear as a bell in my ears. "Tommy?" I frowned, the warmth of the soapy water suddenly feeling ice cold against my skin. Emily didn't know anyone named Tommy. Her friends from preschool had names like Lily and Max, and her baby brother, still too young to speak, definitely wasn't the source of that name. An uneasy chill prickled down my spine as I slowly dried my hands on the dish towel, forcing a smile, trying to brush off the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. Kids make up imaginary friends all the time, I told myself. It's normal. But something inside me wouldn't let it go. That name, Tommy, it echoed in my mind, looping around my thoughts like an itch I couldn't scratch. I tiptoed down the hall, my footsteps soft against the wooden floor, my breath barely a whisper. As I approached Emily's door, I could hear her voice clearer now. She was giggling softly again, the sound so sweet, yet carrying an undercurrent of something wrong. "Tommy, you're so silly," she squealed, followed by a hush. The type of hush that wasn't playful, the type that sucked the warmth out of the air, turning it cold as ice. My hand hovered over the door handle, hesitating for just a moment before I slowly pushed it open. The door creaked, a sound that seemed to drag through the silence like nails on a chalkboard. I peeked inside. Emily sat on the floor, cross-legged, facing the far corner of the room. Her favourite stuffed bear, Mr. Snuggles, sat beside her untouched, but she wasn't looking at the bear. No, her eyes were fixed on the shadows by the closet, her small face unnervingly serious. "Emily," I called softly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Who are you talking to?" She turned her head toward me, her movements slow, deliberate. Her blue eyes, usually so bright and full of life, seemed darker, almost hollow. An unsettling feeling crept over me, my skin prickling as she stared at me for a long moment. "I'm talking to Tommy, Mommy," she said, her voice eerily even, as though I had asked her the most ordinary question in the world. "He lives in the closet." My blood ran cold, every fibre of my being screamed that something was wrong, but I forced a smile, not wanting to alarm her. "Oh, what does Tommy look like?" I asked, hoping it was just her imagination at play. "He doesn't have a face," she answered, her tone disturbingly casual, "but he has sharp teeth and he comes out when it's dark." Sharp teeth? Faceless? My stomach lurched, the floor beneath me feeling unsteady as I fought to maintain my composure. I laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "That's a scary friend you have there, sweetie." Emily didn't smile. Instead, she glanced back toward the closet, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "Tommy doesn't like you, Mummy. He says you're in the way." I swallowed the rising panic and ushered her toward her bed, her little hand cold in mine. That night, as I tucked her in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something lurking in the dark corners of her room. Emily's gaze followed me as I turned to leave, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. "Good night, Mommy," she murmured. "Tommy says he'll visit you tonight." I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just whispered a shaky "good night" and hurried back to my room. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the house felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move in ways it shouldn't. I lay there, wide-eyed, staring into the darkness, half expecting to see something, anything, materialize from the shadows. Just as my body began to surrender to exhaustion, a deafening crash jolted me awake. My heart leaped into my throat as I bolted upright. The sound had come from Emily's room. I ran, fear gripping me so tight it felt like my lungs were on fire. When I threw open the door, the sight before me made my blood run cold. Emily's closet door stood wide open, the hinges creaking as it swayed slightly. Her bed empty. Panic surged through me, my voice trembling as I called her name. No answer. I searched the house, my mind racing, terror gnawing at me with every passing second. Where could she be? I searched every room, every corner, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, in the living room, I saw her. She stood in the middle of the room, her small frame illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. But something was off, her posture, the vacant look in her eyes. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her head slightly tilted as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Emily!" I whispered, my voice shaking. She turned slowly, her eyes glassy, distant. "He wanted me to come with him," she murmured, her voice barely audible. But I said no. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed to her, pulling her close, feeling the coldness of her skin against mine. I held her tightly, but my eyes couldn't help but dart toward the shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. From that night on, everything changed. Tommy never left. He was always there, in the corner of my eye, in the whispers I heard when I passed Emily's room at night. Every night I heard her talking to him, her voice growing fainter, more distant, as though he was pulling her deeper into his world, further away from me. And the worst part? The shadows, they've started moving on their own. They stretch across the floor, creeping closer, like fingers reaching for me, ready to drag me into the darkness. I don't know how much longer I can keep him at bay. He's waiting, he's watching, and soon he'll come for me.
It wasn't unusual for my son, Ethan, to have imaginary friends. At 6 years old, his world was filled with boundless creativity, dragons soaring through the sky, fearless superheroes battling the forces of evil, and secret adventures that only he could truly understand. Every day, Ethan would come up with new characters to fill his vivid, colorful world, and I loved watching his imagination run wild. But lately, things had changed. His imaginary friend wasn't just a passing character in his make-believe stories. This one seemed permanent. This friend had become a constant presence in his life. Ethan spoke to it when he played with his toys, when he ate dinner, and sometimes, most disturbingly, when he was alone in his room at night. And that was when it started to bother me. I first noticed it one evening when we sat down for dinner. Ethan had a plate of his favorite chicken nuggets and fries in front of him, but he barely touched it. Instead, he was mumbling under his breath, as if carrying on a conversation with someone I couldn't see. "Who are you talking to, bud?" I asked, my tone light and playful as I moved around the kitchen, clearing some of the dishes. Ethan didn't look up from his plate. "Her name is Daisy," he said, his voice oddly calm for a 6-year-old. I froze for a second, my hand hovering over the sink. I hadn't heard him mention Daisy before, and there was something about the way he said it that made me uneasy. I quickly forced a smile, pushing the feeling aside. It was just another one of his imaginary friends, after all. Kids have those all the time, right? "Oh, and where's Daisy from?" I asked, feigning interest as I continued to clean up. "She used to live here," Ethan said, still not looking up. He picked at his food, pushing a nugget around the plate. "Before us, before she died." I stopped cold. The dish slipped from my hand, clattering into the sink with a loud bang. I stared at him, my heart beginning to race. Ethan never talked about death. He was a joyful, bright kid, always focused on happy things, like cartoons and his action figures. Death wasn't part of his vocabulary, until now. I swallowed hard and slowly turned to face him. "Ethan, what do you mean she died?" My voice came out shakier than I intended. Ethan finally lifted his head, but he wasn't looking at me. His wide, innocent eyes were fixed on the empty chair beside him, as if someone was sitting there. His gaze was intense, and for the first time in his short life, his expression looked cold. "She doesn't like when you ask questions about her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. A chill crawled down my spine. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just his imagination running wild. But something about the way he said it, something about the way he was staring at that chair, made it feel far too real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house seemed to echo louder than usual. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, even the faint rustle of the trees outside sent shivers down my spine. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that Ethan's words were just the harmless ramblings of a child. But deep down, I felt something stirring, something cold and unsettling. The next few days were filled with strange occurrences. It started small, doors creaking open on their own, lights flickering even when there was no storm, and objects moving from where I had left them. I would place my keys on the counter, only to find them on the table moments later. A picture frame on the wall would be slightly tilted, even though I knew it had been straight. These little things began to pile up, each one adding to the growing sense of unease that had taken root in my chest. Ethan's behavior grew stranger as well. He stopped sleeping through the night, often waking up with dark circles under his eyes, his once bright, cheerful demeanor becoming increasingly withdrawn. He no longer played with his toys the way he used to. Instead, he would sit in his room talking to Daisy. I would hear him muttering to her softly, his words indistinct, but there was always an unsettling tone to his voice. almost as if he was trying to soothe her, or perhaps appease her. One night, I heard Ethan's laughter echoing down the hallway. It was a soft, distant sound, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. What could he possibly be laughing about at this hour? Heart pounding, I rushed to his room, flinging the door open. The room was dark, the faint glow of his nightlight casting long shadows across the walls. But there, in the middle of the room, was Ethan. He was sitting on the floor, cross-legged, his back to me, his eyes locked on the corner. "Ethan," I called, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring. My eyes followed his gaze to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally, thicker and darker than they should have been. My stomach twisted. "She's here," Ethan said softly, his voice distant. "She says you're not welcome anymore." My breath hitched in my throat, and I instinctively took a step back. I wanted to run, to grab Ethan, and get out of that room as fast as I could. But something held me there. Something cold and heavy, like a presence pressing down on my chest. I forced myself to move, scooping Ethan up into my arms. His body felt cold, much colder than it should have been. I held him tight, his small frame limp against me as I carried him out of the room. My hands were trembling, my heart racing as I hurried down the hall, my eyes darting back to that corner, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I tried to go about our normal routine, making breakfast, taking Ethan to school, but everything felt wrong. The air in the house was thick with a tension I couldn't explain, like the walls themselves were closing in on us. I decided to call a priest to bless the house. I wasn't particularly religious, but I didn't know what else to do. The priest arrived that afternoon, a kind older man who listened patiently as I explained what had been happening. He walked through the house, sprinkling holy water in each room, reciting prayers under his breath. When he reached Ethan's room, he paused. His eyes lingered on the corner, the same corner Ethan had been staring at the night before. The priest's face paled, and his hand trembled slightly as he made the sign of the cross. He didn't say anything, but I could tell. He felt it too. That night, after the house had been blessed, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. Ethan slept in my bed, his small body curled up beside me. I thought the worst was over. I thought Daisy had finally left, but I was wrong. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke to the sound of Ethan's whispers. At first, I thought he was talking in his sleep, but then I realized he was wide awake. His lips barely moved, but the words were clear, too clear. "Don't worry, Daisy," he whispered, his voice soft and soothing. "Mommy can't make you leave." I froze, my blood turning to ice. Ethan's eyes were closed, but his body was rigid, as if something was holding him there, keeping him from moving. And then, slowly, his eyes opened, but they weren't his eyes anymore. They were dark, almost black, and they stared straight ahead, unblinking. I reached for him, but before I could touch him, a cold gust of air blew through the room, extinguishing the nightlight. The shadows stretched, thick and suffocating, swallowing the room in darkness. And then I heard it, a faint giggle, soft at first, but growing louder. It wasn't Ethan's laugh. It was a child's laugh, high-pitched and eerie, coming from the corner of the room. Daisy was here. I couldn't see her, but I felt her. The weight of her presence pressed down on me, cold and menacing. She was watching, waiting, and I knew she wasn't going to leave. Not this time, and neither was Ethan.
had been chatting with this guy on Hinge for a couple of weeks, and he seemed like everything I was looking for. His messages were thoughtful and charming, each one perfectly crafted to match my interests. He wasn't just handsome, he was disarmingly attractive. We had the same favourite books, the same sense of humour, and he even shared my love for hiking and obscure indie bands. It felt too good to be true, but he seemed genuine. He suggested we meet up for dinner, and I eagerly agreed. He chose a restaurant a bit out of town. I hesitated for a moment, wondering why he picked somewhere so far, but he explained that it was a hidden gem, a new place with rave reviews. I figured he was just trying to impress me. The pictures online looked incredible, and the thought of dining somewhere trendy excited me. When I arrived, he was already waiting by the entrance. He looked exactly like his photos, maybe even better. Tall, well-dressed, with that same irresistible smile that made my heart race. I felt a wave of relief. So many horror stories start with the person not looking like their photos, but this was different. Dinner started off perfectly. The conversation flowed easily, like we'd known each other for years. We laughed about our shared experiences and bonded over our love for travel. I felt completely at ease. Halfway through the meal, he suggested we go back to his place for drinks. "It's just around the corner," he said, flashing that smile again. I wasn't ready for the night to end, and after all, he seemed so genuine. I agreed. His apartment building was impressive. Tall, modern, with sleek glass windows reflecting the city lights. We took the elevator up, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. This guy seemed perfect in every way. Charming, successful, and now living in a place like this. I felt like I had hit the jackpot. The moment we stepped inside, though, that excitement twisted into something darker. The door clicked shut behind me, louder than it should have been, and a strange sensation crept over me. The air inside felt thick, almost oppressive, like I had just walked into a vacuum. The lighting was dim, casting long, unsettling shadows along the walls. It was a stark contrast to the glossy, polished exterior of the building. His apartment was meticulously clean, but something about it felt wrong. I noticed the decor immediately. Odd things lined the shelves. At first glance, they seemed like antiques, but the closer I looked, the more unsettling they became. Old rusted knives lay on display as if they were art, their edges jagged and stained with something I didn't want to identify. Animal bones arranged in grotesque patterns, hung from the walls like some twisted decoration. My stomach churned, but I told myself it was probably just a weird collection. Some people were into strange things, right? But then I saw the photographs. They were tucked in between the oddities on the shelves, old black and white photos of women. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and their expressions vacant. There was something disturbingly lifeless about them. A shiver ran down my spine as I stared at their faces, trying to understand why he would have pictures of women he didn't know. At least I hoped he didn't know them. I turned to ask him about it, but the moment I looked at him, my breath caught in my throat. His entire demeanor had shifted. The warm, charming guy I had spent the evening with was gone, replaced by something far more sinister. His eyes, once inviting, were now cold and predatory. His smile was twisted into something grotesque, and his body language had changed entirely. He stood taller, more rigid, like he was waiting for something. His pupils were blown wide, almost animalistic, and his gaze locked onto mine like a predator stalking prey. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice low and menacing. I froze, a wave of icy terror crashing over me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Was this some sick joke? A prank? But the look in his eyes told me this was no joke. My phone was in my purse, which I had stupidly placed on the other side of the room. I glanced toward it, trying not to be obvious, but he saw. His grin widened and he took a slow step toward me. "Don't scream," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. Panic flooded my veins. I didn't care what he said. I bolted. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, and I sprinted for the door. But he was fast, too fast. In an instant, he was behind me, his hand gripping my arm with an iron-like force. I twisted, yanking myself free, adrenaline surging through me. I ran blindly down the hall, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I screamed for help. Every step I took echoed loudly in the dark, empty corridor, amplifying my terror. I heard him behind me, his footsteps steady, unhurried, like he knew I couldn't escape. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out every rational thought. Just as I felt his presence closing in on me, a door burst open to my left. A neighbor, an older woman, stood there, her eyes wide with shock as she saw me. Without thinking, I threw myself into her apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. For a moment, everything was silent. I pressed my ear against the door, listening, my chest heaving. But then a soft, slow knock came from the other side. Knock, knock, knock. "You can't hide forever," he whispered through the door, his voice so calm, so unnervingly patient. I could feel my heart in my throat as I backed away, praying that the neighbor would call the police. The knocking stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but eerie silence. But I knew he was still there, watching, waiting. The sound of footsteps slowly faded down the hall, but the fear remained, suffocating me. It's been weeks since that night, and I haven't seen him again, but I know he's still out there, lurking, waiting for his next move. Every time I close my eyes, I see those photographs of the women. I know now what their hollow expressions meant. They weren't just photographs, they were warnings, and I was almost one of them.
I matched with a guy named Daniel on Hinge. From the moment we started talking, everything about him felt perfect, almost too perfect. He was successful, with a high-powered job in finance, and lived in a trendy part of the city. He was kind and thoughtful, always asking me how my day was, or sharing funny little anecdotes about his life that made him seem all the more relatable. We had the same taste in music, loved the same obscure movies, and even had matching interests in weekend hiking trips and coffee shop hunting. It felt like we were destined to meet, and the connection was immediate. For weeks, we texted every day. It wasn't just surface-level conversations either. We talked about our hopes, fears, and even childhood memories. I found myself waiting for his messages, eager to hear from him. Slowly, I began to trust him, feeling like I was getting to know the real him. When he suggested meeting up in person, I didn't hesitate. We had already built such a strong connection. It felt like the natural next step. He picked a bar downtown, a cozy, dimly lit place with exposed brick and craft cocktails. The kind of spot that was always packed on the weekends, but intimate enough for a quiet conversation on a weeknight. I had never been there before, but Daniel assured me it was a hidden gem, his favourite place. The night of our date, I put on my favourite outfit, checked my makeup 100 times, and left with a flutter of nervous excitement. When I arrived, I sent him a quick text. "Hey, I'm here." I waited, expecting an immediate response, but nothing came. I stood outside the bar for a few minutes, thinking maybe he was stuck in traffic. 10 minutes passed, then 20, 30. I started to feel that gnawing sense of unease. I double-checked the address. This was definitely the right place. Maybe he was inside, I thought. Maybe he had already grabbed a table and just hadn't seen my message. I walked in and headed to the bar. The room was dimly lit, with flickering candlelight, casting strange shadows along the exposed brick walls. A few couples were huddled in quiet corners, their hushed conversations blending into the low hum of music. I asked the bartender if anyone had reserved a table for two under the name Daniel. She looked at me, her expression a mix of confusion and mild amusement, and shook her head. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description tonight," she said. Feeling a bit embarrassed, I smiled and sat down at the bar anyway. Maybe he was just running late. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. An hour passed, then another. Still no word. I stared at my phone, the screen glowing back at me with the empty thread of our conversation. My frustration grew, but so did a sense of creeping unease. Why hadn't he responded? Where was he? I decided to call him, dialing his number with shaky fingers, but it went straight to voicemail. "Hi, this is Daniel. I can't come to the phone right now." That same familiar voice I'd heard before, but it did nothing to ease my growing discomfort. I opened our chat on Hinge, scrolling through our messages, trying to find some clue, some explanation for this strange behaviour. But what I saw next made my blood run cold. Every single message he had sent was gone, erased. His profile, the one I had gotten to know so well, was gone too, vanished without a trace, as if he had never existed. I stared at my screen, blinking hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. I dialed his number again, this time more urgently, but instead of his voicemail, I was met with a cold, robotic voice. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. My heart raced, and the room around me seemed to spin. Who was this person? Had I been talking to someone who didn't even exist? I left the bar in a daze, my mind racing with 1,000 questions but no answers. As I walked to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, a prickling sensation crawling up my spine like I was being watched. The city streets, usually alive with people, felt eerily empty. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, and every small noise made me jump. I hurried to my car and locked the doors the moment I got inside, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I searched for Daniel online, hoping to find any trace of him. His social media accounts? Gone. His LinkedIn? Non-existent. It was as if Daniel had never been real at all, as if he had simply evaporated into thin air. Days passed, and I tried to move on, convincing myself that it was just some elaborate prank or a catfishing attempt. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something darker was at play. A few days later, an email arrived in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line sent a chill straight through me. "Did you enjoy our date?" My fingers trembled as I clicked on the email, and what I saw next made my stomach drop. Attached to the email was a photo of me sitting at the bar that night, looking at my phone. It had been taken from outside, across the street. I stared at the image, my heart hammering in my chest. The angle, the timing, it was clear someone had been watching me. But that wasn't the worst part. In the background of the photo, reflected faintly in the bar's window, was a figure. A man standing across the street, watching. I zoomed in on the reflection, trying to make out the details, but it was blurry, distorted. Yet I could feel his eyes on me, even through the photograph. Panicked, I immediately blocked the email, deleted my Hinge account, and changed my phone number. But it didn't help. That night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy and disoriented, I glanced at the screen, and my heart stopped. It was a text from an unknown number. "I enjoyed our date. Let's do it again soon." I threw the phone across the room, my heart pounding. The darkness of my bedroom suddenly felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on me. Every sound in the house, every creak of the floorboards, made my skin crawl. I knew I wasn't alone. For weeks, the messages continued. I received texts from unknown numbers, emails from addresses I didn't recognize. They all said the same thing. Let's do it again soon. But that wasn't the worst part. Sometimes the messages would include photos of me taken without my knowledge. At the grocery store, walking to my car, sitting at a cafe. Whoever this person was, they were watching me, tracking my every move. The police were no help. They said there was no evidence of a crime, just some sick prankster getting off on scaring me. But I knew better. This wasn't a prank. This was something far more sinister. One night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing again. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed the phone with shaking hands and opened the message. It was a photo of me asleep in my bed, taken just moments before. My blood ran cold. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as I looked around the darkened room, my eyes scanning every shadow. I wasn't alone. He was here, somewhere in the darkness, watching me.
I met this guy, Matt, on Hinge. He had an outdoorsy vibe, always posting pictures of himself hiking, camping, or kayaking, and we quickly bonded over our shared love for nature. His messages were full of adventure stories. He'd climbed mountains, explored remote forests, and camped under the stars. There was something magnetic about him, and before long, we were texting every day, sharing our favorite trails, survival tips, and daydreaming about future hikes together. After a few weeks of getting to know each other, Matt suggested we take a weekend trip to a cabin he owned, deep in the woods. He described it as a secluded escape, nestled in the heart of a forest where the trees were ancient and the air was fresh. At first, I hesitated. The thought of being alone with someone I hadn't met in person made me nervous, but he was so convincing, so confident. He painted a picture of tranquility, of campfires and starlit skies, of hiking trails untouched by anyone else. His constant reassurances made me feel safe enough to go. I wanted to believe him. The day of the trip, I packed my gear, comfortable hiking clothes, a sleeping bag, snacks for the hiki, and a small flashlight. Matt picked me up in his old Jeep, its tiers covered in mud, and we set off. The drive to the cabin took longer than I had anticipated. At first, we cruised along well-paved roads, chatting about our favorite national parks and places we wanted to explore together. But soon, the smooth asphalt gave way to gravel and then to narrow dirt paths that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The trees became denser, the sky darker, and an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. By the time we arrived, dusk had already fallen. The cabin was hidden in the woods, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out what little light remained. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, small, old, and weathered by the elements. A thin layer of moss covered the walls, and the windows were dirty, barely letting any light through. I got out of the car and looked around, expecting to see signs of other hikers or campers, but there was nothing, no one. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. No cell signal, no signs of civilization, just us and the trees. Matt seemed excited, almost giddy, but there was something different about him now. The friendly, easygoing guy I had been texting for weeks felt distant, his energy darker, his smile strained. His eyes, once warm and inviting, had a coldness to them. I noticed how his gaze lingered on me, his eyes glinting in the fading light like a predator sizing up its prey. There was something unnerving about it, but I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to nerves from the isolation. We settled in, lit a fire in the cabin's small, dilapidated fireplace, and cooked some food Matt had brought with him. The first night passed quietly enough, though I had trouble sleeping. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though the windows were boarded up and the night outside was pitch black. The creaks and groans of the old cabin played tricks on my mind, and I found myself waking up at every little noise. The next day, Matt suggested we go for a hike. I agreed, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. As we walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisted and gnarled like ancient skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. Matt was unusually quiet at first, his eyes darting around as if he was listening for something. Then he started telling me stories about the area, about people who had gone missing in these woods. His voice was light and playful, but there was a sinister edge to his words that made my skin crawl. He spoke of hikers who had disappeared without a trace, of search parties that had found nothing but the occasional torn piece of clothing or a single hiking boot, abandoned on a trail. "They say the woods here are different," he said, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "People don't just get lost, they get taken." He paused, glancing at me with that eerie smile again. "Nobody would hear us out here, you know. Not for miles." I laughed nervously, trying to play it off, but a shiver ran down my spine. There was something about the way he said it that felt too deliberate, too rehearsed. By the afternoon, I was on edge, my earlier excitement about the trip completely replaced by a growing sense of dread. I tried to bring up leaving early, making an excuse about work or family, but the moment I suggested it, Matt's entire demeanor shifted. His playful tone disappeared, replaced by something much darker. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth I had grown used to. I froze, staring at him, trying to gauge whether he was joking. His expression remained unreadable, his eyes cold and piercing. My heart began to race, the adrenaline surging through me as I suddenly realized how isolated we truly were. No cell signal, no one around for miles, just him and me. That night, after we returned to the cabin, the atmosphere grew even more tense. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and strange noises echoed through the trees. Scratches, whispers, footsteps. At first, I thought it was just animals, but the longer I listened, the more deliberate the sounds became. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching us. I peered out the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I strained to see through the darkness. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure moving between the trees, too tall and too fast to be an animal. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled back from the window, panic rising in my chest. I turned to tell Matt, but he was already standing behind me, his face inches from mine, watching me with that same eerie smile. His eyes gleamed with something unrecognizable, something terrifying. "They come out at night," he whispered, his breath cold against my skin. I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted for the door, my mind racing with fear. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car, but when I got there, I froze. The tires, every single one, had been slashed. Panic surged through me, and I screamed for help, my voice echoing through the trees, but no one answered. No one was coming. I was trapped. I turned back toward the cabin, expecting Matt to come after me. But he didn't. He just stood on the porch, watching me with that same unsettling smile, his arms crossed over his chest like he was waiting for something. "Go ahead," he said, his voice calm. "Scream all you want. Nobody will hear you." Tears streamed down my face as I frantically looked around for a way out. That's when I saw movement in the distance, a figure emerging from the trees, moving closer. I screamed again, hoping it was a passerby, someone who could help me. But as the figure drew nearer, I realized it wasn't just one person. It was several. Shadows, human figures, moving through the trees in perfect silence, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were coming for me. I don't know how, but I managed to run. I ran through the woods, my legs burning, my breath ragged, until I stumbled upon a passing hiker. I must have looked insane, screaming incoherently about Matt and the cabin, but he helped me. He led me to safety, and we called the police. When they arrived, I told them everything. I led them back to where the cabin should have been, but when we got there, the space was empty. There was no cabin, no slashed tires, no Matt. The clearing was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. To this day, I still don't know if Matt was real, or if something far darker had lured me to those woods. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear his voice in my head, whispering, "They come out at night."
The anticipation had been building for months. I'd been counting down the days to see Bad Bunny live, scrolling through fan pages, watching every teaser, and hyping up with my friends. The moment we got our tickets, it was all I could think about. So when the night finally arrived, I should have been bouncing with excitement. But as I entered the arena, something felt wrong. Very wrong. The air was thick, like walking into a dense fog. It pressed against my skin, almost suffocating. I looked around to see if anyone else noticed it, but the crowd was alive with energy. People were laughing, taking selfies, screaming in excitement. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just nerves, but that heavy feeling didn't fade. It only deepened, sinking into my chest like a weight. We found our spots near the stage, surrounded by a sea of people, and for a while, I tried to lose myself in the moment. The lights dimmed, and the arena erupted into cheers. Thousands of voices screamed in unison as the first beats of the music filled the space. Bad Bunny emerged onto the stage, and the noise became deafening. I should have been swept up in it, carried away by the excitement, but the unsettling feeling only grew. And then the vibration started. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable, like a low hum. It crawled through the ground, through my feet, climbing up my legs and burrowing into my bones. I looked down, half expecting to see the floor shaking, but everything appeared normal. No one else seemed to notice. The crowd swayed and danced, lost in the performance, but that hum kept growing, spreading through me, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Bad Bunny's second song kicked in, and that's when the screens flickered. It was just for a moment, a split second. But in that moment, I saw it. Instead of the usual visuals that accompany the performance, there was a face so twisted and grotesque that my brain struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. Its skin was pale and taut, stretched over sharp, angular bones. The eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare directly into my soul. And the mouth, it was wide, impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear in a grotesque smile that seemed to pulsate with malevolence. I blinked, my heart racing. It was gone. The usual visuals were back on the screen, and the crowd didn't seem to notice. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a glitch, a technical error, but I couldn't shake the image of that face, those hollow, staring eyes that seemed to burn into me. The hum beneath my feet grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't coming from the speakers. It was coming from the people around me. I turned, scanning the crowd, and my blood ran cold. Their faces, they weren't right. One by one, people's expressions twisted, contorting into grotesque shapes. their mouths stretched open wider than humanly possible, eyes rolling back into their heads. Their skin seemed to shift, almost as if it were being pulled from the inside. And then they began to scream. But the screams didn't match their movements. Their mouths gaped wide, but the sound that came out wasn't theirs. It was distorted, warped, a guttural howl that didn't belong in this world. I tried to move, but the crowd was too dense. I was trapped, surrounded by bodies that convulsed and writhed as if something was controlling them, using them as puppets. My heart raced, panic flooding through me as I pushed against the sea of people. But no matter where I turned, I was met with the same horrifying sight. More and more people began to collapse, their bodies twitching violently on the ground. Blood oozed from their eyes, their ears, their mouths, pooling beneath them in sickening puddles. And then the face appeared again, on every screen, all around me. The same demonic face with those empty, hollow eyes that burned into me. But this time, it lingered, longer. Its mouth moved, whispering something I couldn't hear, but I felt the words deep inside my chest. The crowd continued to scream, but it was as if their voices were being swallowed by that face, by the darkness that clung to it. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like something was gnawing its way inside me. I stumbled, gasping for air, my vision blurring as I tried to stay upright. My legs felt weak, the ground beneath me shifting and shaking. The music, once loud and booming, had become distorted, twisted into something dark and unrecognizable. It was no longer music, it was a roar, a deep guttural growl that reverberated through my body, shaking me to my core. I looked around desperately for my friends, but they were gone. Or maybe they were part of the writhing, screaming mass of bodies that surrounded me. The arena had transformed into a nightmare. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in on us, and the air grew hotter, thicker, until it felt like I was breathing through a wet cloth. The lights above flickered erratically, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to move on their own. I tried to push through the crowd, but every step was a struggle. The ground beneath me felt unstable, like it was shifting, melting. My feet sunk into the floor as if it were turning into quicksand. I looked down, horrified to see the ground had turned black, tar-like, pulling me down with every step. I screamed, trying to pull myself free, but it was no use. The harder I fought, the deeper I sank. The face flashed on the screens again, larger this time, looming over the arena like a twisted god. Its hollow eyes locked onto me, and I felt a surge of terror, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I could hear its voice now, a low whispering chant that filled my head, drowning out everything else. My chest tightened, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped, sinking into the black, suffocating pit that the arena had become. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was outside the arena, lying on the cold, hard ground. The sky above was dark, and the arena stood silent, looming like a tombstone against the night. The air was still, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I sat up, my body aching, my head spinning. What had happened? I tried to piece it together, but the memories were hazy, fragmented. The concert was over, the arena empty, but the hum that had crawled through the crowd, the hum that had twisted everything into a nightmare, it never left. I could still feel it, vibrating in my bones, in my chest. It followed me home, echoing in the silence of my room, growing louder when the lights went out. Weeks passed, but the feeling only grew stronger. Every night, the hum became more insistent, more oppressive, and with it came the dreams, the face. It haunted me, lurking in the corners of my mind, its hollow eyes staring, always staring. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that arena, sinking into the black pit, the walls closing in around me. Now I don't sleep, I can't. The face waits for me in the dark, whispering in a language I don't understand, but that fills me with an all-consuming dread. The hum grows louder, closer, and I know, deep down, I know it's coming for me.
The crowd erupted in deafening cheers as Bad Bunny took the stage, but as I stood there, surrounded by thousands of fans, I couldn't shake the unsettling sensation crawling up my spine. I'd brushed off the rumours before, whispers of strange occurrences at his concerts, people blacking out, claiming to see things that couldn't be real, supernatural things. I laughed it off, chalking it up to paranoia or attention-seeking lies. But now, standing in the pulsating sea of people, something felt very, very wrong. As the opening notes of the first song vibrated through the air, a chill ran down my body. The lights, once brilliant and electrifying, began to flicker erratically. It was subtle at first, like the dying breath of an old light bulb, but quickly escalated into violent flashes, casting the arena in a blood-red glow. The air thickened, almost suffocating, as if the atmosphere itself was compressing around me. I strained to hear the music over the roar of the crowd, but something strange hit my ears. Bad Bunny's voice. It wasn't right. Beneath the upbeat tempo, beneath his vocals, there was an undercurrent, a deep, gravelly whisper layered into the song. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it sent icy needles of fear down my spine. The crowd swayed, oblivious, entranced by the performance. But I heard it. I heard that sinister voice, chanting something ancient and malevolent beneath the melody. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I glanced around, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone else who noticed. But everyone else danced and screamed, lost in the rhythm. They didn't hear it. How could they not hear it? It was like the walls themselves were vibrating with an evil that I couldn't quite place. I turned back toward the stage, only to find Bad Bunny staring directly into the crowd. His eyes, his once warm and inviting eyes, now cold and empty, like two black voids. Then everything plunged into darkness. The music stopped abruptly, leaving behind a suffocating silence. I blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden blackness, but it was as if the world had been swallowed whole. All around me, nervous whispers began to fill the void. I couldn't see the faces of the people beside me, only the uneasy shifting of bodies, pressing closer together in the dark. And then, the scream. It tore through the arena like a blade, high-pitched and raw, echoing endlessly in the silence. My heart pounded in my chest as the panic spread, the crowd growing restless. When the lights flickered back to life, I gasped. The stage was gone. No platform, no instruments, no lights, just an impossibly vast, gaping hole. It stretched downward into nothingness, an endless black void framed by jagged rocks that gleamed in the low light. Flames licked at the edges, their eerie orange glow casting long, sinister shadows. A foul, putrid smell filled the air, like burnt flesh and decay. From deep within the pit, I heard sounds, inhuman sounds, screams of agony that chilled me to the core, mixed with low, guttural growls that reverberated through the floor. The air buzzed with malevolence, so thick it was hard to breathe. Panic erupted in the crowd. People near the edge began screaming as something invisible seemed to drag them toward the pit. I watched in horror as a man just feet away from me was yanked off his feet, his body flailing as he was pulled into the abyss, his screams growing distant before being abruptly cut off. "No, no!" I screamed, turning to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy, glued to the ground. When I looked down, my blood turned to ice. The floor beneath me had split open, cracks snaking outward, and from within those cracks, thick black tendrils snaked upward, wrapping around my ankles. They coiled tighter, pulling me toward the chasm, toward that endless void. I fought against them, thrashing wildly, trying to shake them off, but they only tightened their grip, cold and unyielding, as if alive. The crowd around me devolved into chaos. People screamed as the tendrils reached out for them too, dragging bodies toward the pit. I could hear bones snapping, flesh tearing as some were ripped apart before they even made it to the edge. My chest tightened with terror as I glanced up at the stage, or where the stage used to be. Bad Bunny was still there, standing at the edge of the pit, but he was no longer the man who had entered the arena. His body convulsed violently, his skin peeling back in long, wet strips. His bones twisted unnaturally, bending in ways that no human body could. His face contorted, his mouth widening grotesquely as his skin split, revealing jagged yellowed teeth beneath. His eyes, once cold and empty, now glowed with a malevolent fire, as if something ancient and dark had taken root inside him. He opened his mouth, and from his throat came a sound that no human should ever be able to make, a deep, guttural growl that rattled my bones. He began to sing again, but the lyrics were warped, his voice distorted, demonic. The words were unintelligible, but I could feel their power, their darkness seeping into my mind, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I screamed, pulling desperately at the tendrils, my heart racing so fast it felt like it might burst. The ground beneath me crumbled further, the pit expanding, swallowing more and more of the arena. Bodies continued to fall, sucked into the abyss, their blood splattering across the floor as they were ripped apart, their screams fading into the depths. I could feel myself slipping, my strength fading as the tendrils dragged me closer to the edge. The pit loomed before me, an endless, yawning maw of darkness, and from within it I could hear them, the voices. Screams, not just of pain, but of despair, of souls lost to eternal torment. In a final, desperate act, I tore at the tendrils with everything I had, my fingers bleeding as I clawed at the black vines. I managed to pull one leg free, stumbling backward, away from the chasm. I ran, my heart pounding, but even as I escaped the arena, I knew it wasn't over. The screams followed me, echoing in my mind, inescapable. Now, every time I close my eyes, I'm back there. I see the pit, feel the tendrils tightening around me, hear the demonic growl of something ancient and evil lurking just beneath the surface. The worst part? I know it's not just a memory. It's waiting for me. Each night, the pit grows larger in my nightmares, the tendrils reaching further, pulling me closer to the edge. And one night, I won't wake up.
My friends and I had been counting down the days for weeks, no, months. The anticipation for the Bad Bunny concert was almost unbearable. We had our tickets, our outfits planned, and we made sure to get there early, to snag the perfect spot near the stage. The energy was electric, and as we squeezed into the packed arena, the excitement in the air was contagious. Thousands of people pressed together, waiting, buzzing with anticipation. This was supposed to be the night of our lives, but from the very beginning, something felt off. As the lights dimmed and the first beat of the opening song hit, the crowd exploded into cheers. Bad Bunny took the stage, his presence commanding, and yet, in the middle of the madness, I noticed something unsettling. At first, it was just a flicker, shadows darting across the crowd, faster than any stage light could move. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the shadows kept moving, racing from one end of the arena to the other. They weren't part of the show. And then I noticed the people. Where the shadows passed, they left something behind. A change. The man next to me, who had been dancing only moments before, suddenly froze. His eyes widened, and then, without warning, he began clawing at his arms, hard. His nails tore through his skin, the sound of flesh ripping filling my ears. Blood trickled down his arms, soaking his shirt, but he didn't stop. His fingers dug deeper, scraping bone, his face contorted in pain and fear. But his eyes were hollow, rolling back into his skull. With a final violent shudder, he collapsed to the ground, convulsing in a pool of his own blood. I stumbled backward, horrified, my heart racing. My mouth opened to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I spun around, looking for my friends, but the same thing was happening all around me. More people were scratching, tearing at their own flesh, their bodies writhing on the floor. Screams echoed through the arena, mingling with the pounding music, but it was as if no one could hear them. The panic was suffocating, but what terrified me most was the others, the people who hadn't changed. They kept dancing, oblivious, moving in time with the music, as if nothing was wrong. How could they not see? How could they not feel it? My gaze snapped back to the stage. Bad Bunny was still performing, but his face wasn't right. His smile was too wide, his lips stretching unnaturally, the corners of his mouth curling upward in a grotesque grin. And his eyes were nothing but black voids, bottomless and empty. It felt like he was staring directly at me, like he could see inside my soul, and the longer I looked, the colder I felt. The music distorted, the beat slowing down, twisting into something wrong. It was no longer the catchy, energetic rhythm everyone had come to hear. Instead, it was dark, deep guttural growls that vibrated through the floor, through my body, each note like a sickening pulse that made my stomach churn. The lights flickered, flashing with every beat, and in each strobe of light, I saw something new, something worse. The front of the stage was a massacre. Bodies lay piled atop one another, limbs twisted in unnatural angles, their skin shredded, blood pooled beneath them, soaking into the floor, the metallic stench so thick in the air that it clung to my throat, making it hard to breathe. Something slithered among the bodies, a dark, sinuous shape that moved too quickly for me to focus on. It slid through the carnage, its glowing red eyes fixating on the crowd, leaving a trail of gore in its wake. Every time I blinked, it disappeared, only to reappear closer, moving faster than my mind could process. Then I felt it, a sharp, burning sensation on my arm. I looked down, and my heart nearly stopped. Symbols, strange, ancient runes, were being carved into my skin. The lines appeared as if drawn by an invisible blade, each stroke searing into my flesh, blood bubbling to the surface. I hadn't touched anything, but there they were, deep and jagged. I screamed, desperately trying to scrub them away, but the harder I tried, the more they seemed to burn. My skin felt like it was on fire, the pain unbearable, but the symbols were etched in, immovable, pulsing with a faint red glow. Fear gripped me like a vice. I had to get out. I turned to run, pushing through the crowd, but it was chaos. Some people still danced, completely unaware of the horror unfolding around them, while others were on the ground, twitching, their bodies shredded and torn by unseen forces. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their faces frozen in terror. Blood sprayed into the air as more bodies were pulled apart, limbs flying, torsos ripped open. The crowd surged, a wave of confusion and death, and I was trapped in the middle of it all. I shoved my way through, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the air thick with the stench of blood and death. My arms still burned, the symbols glowing brighter now, casting a faint light in the dark. The music had warped into a nightmarish roar, the bass so deep it felt like the arena itself was shaking. The lights flickered again, and in the brief flashes, I saw the creature. Closer this time, its serpentine body coiled around the stage, its eyes locked onto me. I screamed, my voice lost in the chaos. I had to get out. I had to run. Finally, I broke free, stumbling out of the arena and into the cold night air. My heart was pounding, my skin slick with sweat and blood. The sound of the concert still echoed in my ears, that distorted, guttural music, as if it was following me. I looked down at my arm, and the symbols were still there, carved deep into my flesh, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Weeks have passed, but the marks won't fade. At night, they glow faintly in the dark, casting eerie red light across my bedroom. And sometimes, when everything is silent, I can still hear it. The growl of the music, the screams of the crowd, the whisper of something dark and ancient, waiting just beyond the edge of reality. I know the concert never really ended. It's still happening somewhere, in some twisted, nightmarish version of reality, and the symbols on my arm are a reminder that I'm not safe. None of us are.